Indian philosophy. Of course, I teach it to novices, but what I want to say to you tonight is just a few words, perhaps, and to my Indian friends, I also want to propose that you may not be aware of the impact that Indian philosophy has had on the rest of the global village. I mean, you all know full well that the global village has knitted together a really interesting and moving dynamic fabric of cultures and values and systems, and has brought together many peoples who hitherto have been separated for centuries or even millennia. It has also commingled ideologies and beliefs about the world. It's a great tapestry, and one of the most important strands, and it's going to be significant in centuries to come, will be the philosophy of India. It's not one system at all. It's a network of at least 6 orthodox and at least 3 heterodox schools, all of which have slightly different variations on common themes. But from a Western perspective, it is absolutely incredible, and let me tell you why. About 80% of the world's peoples now live under the aegis of one of 4 great civilizations. How we define these things is a bit slippery, but for the sake of argument, we can understand that civilization is a very long-lived cluster of ideas with a tremendous purchase that glues people together and orients them in a certain way. And 80% of the world's people now live either under what remains of Western civilization, or indeed Islamic civilization, which is burgeoning, or indeed Chinese civilization in East Asia, or Indian civilization. Each of these 4 has more than 1 billion people under its aegis, and some of them are more thoroughly commingled than others. And each one has a kind of cultural DNA. If you want to think in very snappy terms of a quick and dirty characterization, we could say that in China there's basically no God, no prophet, and no book. They have, a certain authoritarian way and a high degree of social organization, and precepts which are transmitted but not yet much innovated. In the West, you could say that we have any God, any prophet, any book. Walk into Barnes & Noble or shop online on Amazon. They're not paying me to say this, but you can find anyone, and Westerners are more or less free to pick and choose. Yes, or have a different one every day of the week. And that's what we do, or none at all. Under Islamic civilization, because it's an Abrahamic faith, very strong in its faith, there is one God, one prophet, one book. Yes? But India is the most beautiful, because in India they have all gods, all prophets, and all books. It is certainly the most inclusive and the most tolerant and the most open. And it's for a Westerner, if you want to begin to access it, the triumvirate of books you could look at would be firstly the Upanishads, and secondly, the Patanjali Yogic Sutras. They invented yoga, remember, and I'll tell you why that's important for Westerners in a moment. And also the Bhagavad Gita, which is the 6th book of the Mahabharata, but it's common to almost all of the schools of Indian philosophy. And in the Bhagavad Gita, you will find this most beautiful saying when Krishna says to Arjuna, who's despondent in the eve of battle and doesn't know where his duty lies, and Krishna says to him, by whatever road they travel, they come to me at last. And this is just a wonderfully open-minded kind of contrast. We have all heard in the West the fire and brimstone, and this is the only way, and if you don't follow this way, you'll burn in hell. And we've all been hearing that for a while. And it's scary to some people, but it doesn't deter the fearless. That's the worst part. But the Bhagavad Gita just says, you travel anyway, and you will come to the center. And that center is the connection of the divine spark in all of us with the great Godhead, the source of all in the cosmos. And we're all on this spiritual journey in Indian philosophy, if I've got it right. We are all on a slightly different path, but all paths will converge to the center. And the Indians are very patient people, because they are long-lived and long seeing into the future. So it might take 1 million or 2 lifetimes, but that's really of no consequence, is it, Parag? We have all the time in the universe. Then if you start looking at the scientific history of this, you'll see that the Indian cosmology corresponds most closely with current scientific estimates about the age of the universe, the kalpas, and the enormous numbers which Indians were capable of thinking, and not to mention zero, which they introduced, very useful placeholder. The mathematics and the cosmology combined to give a picture. Yes? You have a question? You have an issue with this already. All right.
The biggest issue I have is this. The rest of the world uses the number system 10 to the power of 3.
Yes.
10 to the power 3, 6, 9, 12, etc.
Yes.
And Indians, despite being very mathematicians, and I'm not myself,
All right.
why do they use a stupid system of crores, which nobody.
Yeah, the crore, yeah, okay. Well, you have to take that up with your government. I mean, it's more of a political rather than a mathematical problem. About the Indians, and I'm speaking as a Westerner who is a devotee of Indian philosophy, I can tell you that the way of thinking about the cosmos has been effective not only in their understandings of cosmological time being the closest to the Western scientific one currently, but also in many other respects. We have, for no accidental reason, so many Indian physicists, mathematicians, engineers, because the way of thinking and this openness and the susceptibility to pattern and to rhythm and to perception of cycles and things has given rise to a kind of wonderful aptitude for Western kinds of science. Even in the most horrific circumstances, when Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the A-bomb, witnessed the first nuclear detonation in Alamogordo, he was moved to think not of this Greek myth, Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, yes? He quoted from the Bhagavad Gita when Krishna manifests as Kali, the goddess of destruction, and says, "Now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." So even this was presaged in ancient Indian cosmology, that the universe is constantly morphing through different cycles of creation, of change, of destruction, of rebirth. So this universe that we live in, this enormous cyclical cosmic thing, was also understood in these ancient Vedic times. And then comes Buddha, and who is completely unorthodox. And Siddhartha Gautama in about 500 BC says, well, I'm going to reform this thing because it's not good enough to go to everybody. There's a priest caste and the Brahmins have made themselves very special and have said to everyone else, you need umpteen lifetimes to get to where we are. And he's offended by this. He wants to be more egalitarian. So he selects from Vedic philosophy those elements which he finds utilitarian and useful and offerable to everyone in this life, and he rejects from Vedic authority those pronouncements which would condemn people to millennia of servitude. And he makes a great gift of this. And do you know what the Vedic authorities say? They say, well, he rejects the authority of the Vedas. This is all contained in the Vedas. Not a problem. So I submit to you that Buddhism actually is India's greatest export to date. You may have others. But it got folded back into India, where it's just another unorthodox school, and you'll find a few Buddhists there. But look where it went. It went to Tibet, where they produced some of the most powerful yogas ever known to us. More about yoga in a moment. But based on the old Indian teachings, based on the Hindu system. It went into Southeast Asia as Theravada Buddhism, became a monastic Buddhism. But then along came another Indian, Nagarjuna, a brilliant man who reformulated, much as Luther later reformulated Christianity. Nagarjuna was like the Luther of Buddhism, and he said, well, this monastic Buddhism is looking too authoritarian, so let's give it back to the people again. And he called the Lotus Sutra, one of the late teachings of Buddha, the Lotus Sutra, he said, is the great physician which can transform poison into medicine. And cheers, we'll drink to that. To the Lotus Sutra. The idea is that suffering is not necessary, simply put. And all of these philosophies are not abstract systems of word parsing in professional journals. They amount to practices and precepts which everyone can follow in their own lives according to their own way, and alleviate their suffering and the suffering of others and make this a better world. It's a philosophy of liberation, of enlightenment, of self-improvement, and of the amelioration of all concerned. There's absolutely no negative note in it that I can find after only 40 years.
Thank you.
So Buddhism went everywhere. I mean, it went from the Theravada and the Reformation into China, and China transformed Buddhism. Bodhidharma brought it there, and the Taoists were fascinated. They said, this is an amazing teaching. And first they framed it in Taoist language, and then they sent scholars to India, to Nepal, and they learned the Sanskrit, and they were able then to translate it into Chinese. China was a crucible which transformed Mahayana Buddhism, where it then went to Korea and to Japan, and then ultimately to the West. So this is a gift of Indian civilization to the West. You would be astonished to know how many Buddhists there are in the West now. There are millions, and there are going to be more and more. But the U.S. is kind of polarized. Some of you have heard this. We do have a lot of very religious people there. The Christian coalition is still strong. But on the left, we have half of American population with no moral compass at all. They become so secularized, so deconstructed. They're entirely bereft of any notion of right and wrong. Everything has been relativized. They have no idea what to do. And so they look to the wisdom of India, and particularly to this great export Buddhism for a moral compass in life. So millions of Jews and Christians, and it's beginning now also to go into Islam in the New World. They don't see it as a threat. There's no God being pitted against their God. There's only a way of being a better person, and that would be a better Christian or a better Jew or a better Muslim too. We're all human beings, my friends, and the thing which is most fundamentally human about us does not have a name. So this is the gift of Buddhism. Popular culture in the 60s was infused with Indian philosophy. I don't have to tell you, the Beatles did a great thing by going to India and bringing transcendental meditation to the West. And there had then started a whole industry, sort of carriage trade of gurus who came to the West and attracted, hundreds of thousands or millions of followers. Somebody asked me about Osho. Who was it? Originally Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, yeah? And then he rebranded himself, or they rebranded him posthumously, I think, as Osho. So he had a huge following too. And there was Guru Maharaji and you know so many. Vivekananda, though, was the first one to come to America. Vivekananda came in early 20th century. Yes, and he came to Boston first, and he set up an ashram. And that was probably the first ashram in the United States, and no one knew what it was. It was very mysterious. But the Theosophists knew. Schopenhauer, who was absolutely incorrigibly unhappy, morose, depressed, today would be diagnosed, no doubt, in the DSM, philosophical personality disorder of some kind. Schopenhauer saw Indian philosophy as a panacea for suffering. It even took the edge off his suffering, okay? And then you had Nietzsche seized upon Buddhism as a kind of a blunt instrument for beat Christianity. He misunderstood it totally. But he understood there was some wisdom there. And then the Theosophists, also Madame Blavatsky and others, were attracted to the wisdom of India, yes, as a source of enlightenment. There was a Canadian physician named R.M. Buck, who around the same time had a spontaneous Kundalini experience through a total accident, and sometimes it happens. His crown chakra was opened. He found himself bathed in white light. He had a mystical awakening, but he had no context. He thought he was mad. And then he sought out poets. He found great English poets to help orient him also back to the source of this mystical awakening. So Westerners began. Aldous Huxley very famously spoke of the perennial philosophy, and again the greatness of Indian philosophy and its utility in the West. So this has gone on and on. It's a process that continues to unfold, and in one way or another, as I say to you, I'm just a devotee. I think it's absolutely a wonderful way of looking at things, but more importantly, there's a new relevance. So I'll just finish with that, and then we can have some dialogue, hopefully, and maybe even more whiskey, I don't know. Yes. But the new relevance is this, that we have in the West, and listen, my Indian friends, please take note, because you are talking about development and all the things you must do, to improve your own situation. You're the leading edge in India is where everybody else is, but this trailing edge has to be picked up, and you want to modernize and develop and, of course, improve all these things in the less developed sectors. That makes perfect sense. But please don't lose sight of what's happened in the West, because in the westernized countries, we now have a very deep spiritual crisis, right? Every country which has allowed itself to become too westernized has also completely dissolved its spiritual values. Western civilization is like a cultural paint stripper. And if you're exposed to it, it will absolutely dissolve the fabric of your own society. And please be careful when you modernize, to watch out for this affliction. There are names for it. In Germany, there is a name. It's called Zivilisationskrankheit. Right?
I don't know.
Diseases of civilization. In Sweden, they call it diseases of affluence. In Japan, which has become very westernized in some ways to its own detriment, they call it lifestyle maladies. And in the United States, which leads the way, they don't even have a name for it. All right, so we're giving them one.
It detects everybody.
Culturally induced illness. Culturally induced illness. What are these things? These are epidemics which have no biological epidemiology at all. These are not airborne. These are not viruses. These are not bacilli. These are diseases of civilization, a civilization which is out of control because it's lost touch with its own spirituality. Some manifestations include obesity. The number one health problem in the United States today is obesity, and juvenile obesity is now reducing the life expectancies of children for the first time in many generations. We're seeing life expectancy go the other way. This is a spiritual void which cannot be filled with bad food. And that's what they're trying to do.
Sir, if I may interrupt you just quickly.
Indeed.
Just to let everybody know, the coaches are leaving now to go back to the hotel. They'll be leaving on schedule at 11:30.
Fine.
So if you want to go on the coaches,
Yes.
you make your way downstairs.
Well, then we'll finish on this note, lest we be stranded in this place with no whiskey. Culturally induced illnesses include obesity, eating disorders, sleeping disorders, ADHDs. All of these things are being diagnosed and drugged as though they were somatic illnesses, which they are not. The relevance of Indian philosophy is that there is no civilization in the world that has more deeply plumbed the mysteries of human consciousness and the powers of the mind. And so these ancient yogic systems are the very remedies for all of these spiritual problems which are afflicting our people in the West. So please, to my Indian friends, don't lose sight of the power of your own philosophical roots and never lose touch with them as you acquire more and more technology. Thank you very much.
Cheers.